Art can, of course, inspire a very forceful response. And so when the ideas that an artwork represents are considered harmful or incompatible with a desired message or point of view, artworks might be censored or removed from the public eye. Sometimes, though, the impact of an artwork is so powerful that a viewer may wish to destroy it along with the message or attitude that they see represented within it. So here we have the famous Rokeby Venus, or the Toilet of Venus, by the Spanish artist Diego Velázquez. And looking at it now, it may seem rather tame or innocuous, but in 1914 it was the target of a rather violent protest. A woman named Mary Richardson hid a meat cleaver within her coat and entered into the National Gallery in London and slashed this painting 7 times. Now, Mary Richardson was a member of the British suffragette movement, which campaigned to give women the right to vote. And for her, the painting represented a very sexist definition of ideal beauty and showed a woman solely as an object of male desire. She was motivated more specifically to protest against the imprisonment of the suffragette leader, Emmeline Pankhurst. In 1967, American post-war artist Barnett Newman finished what would prove to be one of his largest paintings, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, number 3. It was the third in a series, and the title was a reference to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, the landmark play which later became a very well-known movie. Newman was a member of the abstract expressionist group that came out of New York in the 1940s. These artists were known for creating big canvases full of wild colors, shapes, and splashes of paint. And like many other abstract expressionists, Newman saw his works as being reactions to the horrors of World War II. For him, figuring out what a painter could do after witnessing events such as the Holocaust or the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki required ignoring all of art history and starting over from scratch. He started making large paintings that were big even for abstract expressionist standards. They often could fill the entire wall of a gallery on their own. They usually featured very few colors, usually one solid hue broken up by a few vertical stripes, which Newman referred to as zips. Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3 is a nearly 18-foot wide canvas, and it's about 8 feet tall. On the left side, a small strip of blue, and on the right, a small strip of yellow, but the rest of the surface is painted entirely red. This painting ultimately produced such strong reactions in people that it drove them to action. In 1969, the painting went to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Dutch artist Barbara Visser, who at the time was a 9-year-old girl, remembers going on a school field trip to the art museum where she first saw Barnett's Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3. She says, seeing the painting, she got very angry. She said, "I ran out of the museum, I sat on the steps, and I was determined not to go in again." She recalls that when the painting first arrived at the museum, a lot of people didn't like it. She said, at the time, people would write really long and elaborate letters to say how much they hated this painting. The painting elicited the kind of response that a lot of people still have to abstract art. They question why it is considered art at all when it seems as though anyone could do it. And one woman even expressed that it literally made her sick. In the 1980s, the painting was the centerpiece of an exhibit at the museum called the Grand Parade. And the purpose of this exhibit was to raise exactly this question of what is or is not a painting. This was when the negative opinions of Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3 were taken to a whole new level. While the painting was on display, a man named Gerard Jan van Bladeren tacked Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3 with a box cutter, tracing a series of long slashes through the center of the canvas. When the slashes were added up, altogether they measured nearly 50 feet long. Van Bladeren was 31 years old. He was unemployed. He lived with his parents, and he was a painter himself, although not a very successful one. He regarded this act of violence and vandalism as an artistic gesture, and he saw the painting as a kind of cultural provocation. And one of the main arguments that his lawyer made in his defense was that this provocation called for a reaction, and it got one. Van Bladeren was sentenced to 5 months in prison and stood by his actions as a defense of artistic values. Many people in the Netherlands agreed and sent letters to the museum. One read, "This so-called vandal should be made the director of modern museums. He did what hundreds of thousands of us would have liked to do." The act of restoring this painting was very challenging. There are a set of rules that conservators must follow when restoring a work, and the first is that you should make every effort not to use any material that cannot be removed or reversed in the future. If a conservator adds paint to a canvas, they want to make sure that that can be dissolved and removed later in case the artwork needs to be retouched again in the future. Conservators also try to preserve as much of the original material as possible and only touch the areas that need treatment. Typically, a conservator should also really study the artist and look at their past work in order to get a sense of what they were trying to achieve. Now, the biggest challenge with repairing this painting is its simplicity. If it were a Picasso or a Rembrandt painting, the busy texture and detail would help mask the repair work. But since Newman's canvas was mostly just one big swath of uniform color, any signs of repair would stand out very easily. So a conservator based in Long Island who had worked with Newman previously, Daniel Goldrear, said that he could repair the painting within 98% accuracy and that when he was done, the slashes would be virtually invisible. So the museum packed up the painting and sent it off to Goldrear's studio in New York. 4 years later, when it was unveiled within the museum again, people immediately began noticing a difference. Previously, there had been a shimmering quality to the red paint that gave it a sense of depth. But now all of that was gone, and it had been replaced with a very flat-looking red paint that, according to the restoration's critics, robbed the painting of its original power. So the City Council of Amsterdam sent the painting to a forensic lab to figure out what Goldreyer had done, and they concluded that he had used a paint roller to lay down several layers of dull acrylic paint similar to house paint over the original. And so their analysis, if correct, determined that Goldreyer had rolled over the entire canvas of a 20th century masterpiece with house paint. So essentially, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3 had been vandalized a second time. Goldreyer maintained that he had not painted over the entire canvas, but had only pinpointed the red part where the slashes were, but the forensic analysis refuted this. Goldreyer did, however, sue the museum for defamation, and the museum ended up settling with him because the director had previously signed off on the restoration. The whole event ends up costing the museum over $1 million, and then they were still stuck with a damaged painting. Then, in 1997, 11 years after the original slashing, von Blarieden, who was now out of jail, found out about the botched restoration of Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #3, and found out that it had been returned to the museum. And so he returned to the museum to slash it again. However, the painting was no longer on display. Instead, he found another painting by Barnett Newman, a large blue canvas with a white zip down the middle titled Cathedra, and he slashed this canvas 7 times with his box cutter. When he was done, he threw a packet of pamphlets on the floor that contained rambling, incoherent writings and calmly waited for the police to come and collect him. At his second trial, Van Bladeren was declared mentally unfit and sent to a psychiatric institution. While these particular attacks were motivated by an apparent hatred of abstract or modern art and by mental illness, they are only part of a long, sad history of art vandalism. And Barnett Newman's works in particular have been vandalized several times for anti-Semitic reasons. He was a Jewish artist, and Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue #4, which is the sequel to Who's Afraid #3, was struck and spit on in Germany in 1982 by a 29-year-old veterinary medical student, Joseph Niklaus Klier, who claimed that it was a perversion of the German flag. One of Newman's sculptures at a museum in Houston was spray painted with swastikas in 1979, and then just last year or the year before, someone poured white paint into the reflecting pool that surrounded that same sculpture and left behind a packet of white supremacist leaflets as well. Works were deliberately displayed awkwardly, and labels on the walls ridiculed the artworks. One label read, "We act as if we were painters, poets, or whatever, but what we are is simply and aesthetically impudent. Our impudence, we take the world for a ride and train snobs to lick our boots." Censorship is another big topic in the world of art. Censorship often has the ability to cause shifts in public opinion, and for this reason, artworks and the artists who created them are often amongst the first to be targeted by tyrannical governments. And they're often also some of the first victims in times of war. Now, we're looking here at a couple of photographs from the Nazi-curated Degenerate Art Exhibition. This was a traveling exhibition. Its first stop in 1937 was in Munich, Germany. Now, as a young man, Adolf Hitler sold realistic watercolors and painted postcards on the streets of Vienna, but he failed twice to be accepted into the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. This academy did, however, accept several artists with more abstract styles. Hitler never got over this disappointment, and he abhorred modern art, in particular that of the German Expressionists. In 1930s, In Germany, Hitler's National Socialist or Nazi regime launched a systematic and large-scale attack on modern art that did not conform to Nazi Party goals. The Nazis initially confiscated around 5,000 works of art from museums, but later they took a further 16,500 works from private collections. Some 4,000 of these were burned. Others became the property of Nazi collectors or were sold to foreign collectors for Nazi profit. The artists who made them were banned from working. The Nazis also dismissed museum directors, closed art schools, and burned books. On July 18, 1937, the Nazis opened an exhibition of great German art, which displayed the kind of art that they approved. The next day, they opened another show of 730 works called degenerate art to suggest that these were the work of mentally deficient artists. Artists targeted with this exhibition included Egon Schiele, Otto Dix, Paul Klee, Marc Chagall, Max Ernst, Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, and Vincent van Gogh. But one of the artists whose work was particularly ridiculed in this exhibition was Emil Nolde. He had a series of 9 panels on the life of Christ that were hung together next to the writing on the wall that said, "Mockery of the Divine." The crucifixion, which was the largest panel of the series, was placed in the center. Its unnaturally bright colors, the greenish pallor of Christ and the other figures, and the blurry, unfinished look of the paintings made them, in the eyes of the creators of the exhibition, anti-religious. However, unlike most of the artists that were mocked in this show, Emil Nolde was himself a member of the Nazi Party, and he was so appalled to see his artwork in the exhibition that he wrote to Paul Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, demanding that the defamation against him cease. Nolde's paintings were eventually returned to him, but he was ordered to stop making art. He continued to create watercolors in secret, but he was afraid he would be discovered if he used strong-smelling oil paints. Despite the constraints he was under, Nolde was actually one of the lucky artists. Dozens of others whose work was featured in the show fled Germany or committed suicide, and many were later sent to concentration camps. Attendance at the Degenerate Art exhibition was unparalleled for the time, and more than 2 million visitors came to the exhibition in Munich alone, and 1 million more went to the show while it was on tour through the rest of Germany and Austria. Although there are records of people spitting on the artworks, there remains little other evidence of what visitors actually thought of the art in this propaganda spectacle. When the exhibitions ended, the Nazis sold some of the artworks to raise money for their impending war effort, but most of the works were destroyed, along with thousands of others considered degenerate. The freedom to create art and to have opinions about it are emblems of a peaceful society. The degenerate art show and the book burnings perpetuated by Nazis are 2 examples of how extreme censorship can result in the end of peace and freedom for many.